Hello, everybody. And today, what we're going to focus on is the Industrial Revolution's social effects. And what I'm doing with the last bit of the unit is combining some different topics. So you won't see a topic number necessarily, but the idea is to take a general look at how the Industrial Revolution impacts society. And when we talk about this, we're going to generalize. We're going to be in the United States and in Europe. Um, Japan is going to have similar experiences. So is Russia. Just about any country that experiences industrialization is going to have this general pattern, and sometimes it varies from country to country. But for world history's purposes, we can kind of stay very much focused on generalizations. So, without any further ado, we'll get to it. First, let's talk about the effects on the labor class, on the working class. One, there is this concept called the proletarianization of labor. And what the proletarianization of labor means is that laborers or workers are being treated as a cog in the machine. That in the processes of producing things, a laborer is just there to be put into place to do the work. And the expression proletarianization and a cog in the machine is meant to show how the laborer is becoming dehumanized in the working experience. In other words, and this brings us to number two, labor is increasingly viewed as a commodity to be used in the means of production or in the process of production. And that actually gets me into number three. So if we look at number two, labor viewed as a commodity means that you pay labor according to what the market dictates. That labor is only useful as long as it is useful. Once you don't need the laborer anymore, you let the laborer go. So the laborer is only there to provide the service of labor as long as it is needed and at a cost that is dictated by the market, as opposed to having this dictated by loyalty or dictated by a concern with the person's well-being. So labor is just seen as another part of the production process. It's just another factor to take into account. And if you can limit the costs of labor, then you will become more profitable. So the idea of providing a person with a job, for the sake of their sake is becoming less and less of a factor. And now jobs are just being seen as part of the machine. And when you think about industrialization, the criticism is that more and more the world is viewed as just one big machine that needs to be operated, and the compassion and the humanity is being lost. So when we look at a story such as A Christmas Carol, this is part of the focus is that to Ebenezer Scrooge, Bob Cratchit is just another part of the necessity of business. There is no loyalty from Scrooge to Bob Cratchit until he has his awakening, till he has his redemption. And then helping Bob Cratchit because he's a fellow human becomes the priority. So we see this movement that labor is more and more being treated as a commodity as opposed to seeing them as human beings. So that's going to explain a lot of the conditions of the industrial work. So you guys know this from US history. The low wages, long hours, and unsafe conditions are pretty standard fare for factory work. And in the beginnings of like the early 1800s, we can extend this all the way through until the 1950s, 1960s, probably around 1930s, 1940s. But the other thing that we want to consider is the exploitation of vulnerable groups, such as women and children. So in the 1800s, women and children were often utilized for unskilled, low paying labor and dangerous labor at that. Coal mines and textile factories are the two biggest employees of women and children. And so when we talk about women and children being exploited for their labor, children really weren't in a position to defend themselves or demand more. Women were not legally seen as equals to men. So paying these groups less wages and exposing them to more dangerous conditions was probably permitted more by the law than doing it to the male equivalent. But here's the big thing is that as evidence grows that women are working in coal mines, often stripped of clothes, that children are working in textile factories in conditions that people would reject as inhumane. As that became more publicly known, particularly in Britain, Parliament is going to launch a series of investigations. And those investigations are going to review an abuse that most of the public finds distasteful. And that's going to lead you to labor reforms. So groups are going to start advocating for changes to the way labor is regulated. And initially, we look at laws that Parliament passes, such as the Factory Act of 1833. The Factory Act of 1833 is going to limit labor from children. It's going to put an age requirement. If a child is 8 or younger, they're not allowed to be employed. If a child is 9 to 13 years old, they can be employed under reduced hours and they have to be provided an education. And any child 14 or over could be employed as people saw fit. Later, the pressure for reform is still building, and we get the 10 Hours Act of 1847, which reduced the number of hours that vulnerable groups such as young children, and when I say young children, I'm talking up to 18, and women could be required to work, that a 10-hour cap was placed there. Now, of course, this is going to go down over time, and future laws are going to continue to reduce hours and improve conditions. However, we're going to see this really with women and children, where the law steps in to protect these two groups. So, what then of the male workers? The male workers are going to more resort to labor unions to achieve their ends, using strikes and protests to demand better wages, better conditions, and shorter hours, but also using the power of these group of men to come together and vote for a particular party or for a particular candidate that promised to deliver political or labor reforms. So, political organization, the use of strikes and protests, this will set up conflicts, particularly in the United States, between labor unions and businesses. But this is happening throughout Europe, where labor unions are forming, and this is where men are going to get primarily their change. They're not going to have a government that goes, oh, we have to protect this poor group. They're going to get a government that sort of faces off, and the unions are going to apply the pressure to eventually get the reforms that they seek. And again, this is an ongoing development. This isn't something that necessarily stops in 1900. It's something that we're going to see throughout the 20th century. So, our next topic is the topic of urbanization. So, one, we have a growing population in the cities. So, cities across the board in Europe, the United States, there are more cities with more people in it. These people coming into the cities represent an influx of unskilled laborers that can work cheaply in factories. So, one of the consequences, or three of the consequences to this increased urbanization, one is housing. Simply put, there's not enough housing to keep up with the population growth. There's more people in cities than there are beds for them to sleep in. So, this is going to lead to almost a chaotic situation, overcrowded conditions within the homes, people on the streets, people begging. It's going to create a situation that most of the time people didn't want to see in cities. But because of just the sheer volume of people, there's going to be an increased demand for better housing solutions. Second, sanitation. Human beings produce waste, both from their bodies and by virtue of their activities. And this waste, there's really no place for this waste to go. So now you have an increasingly filthy society. And this a filthy society is going to be a society that promotes diseases and is going to promote poor health. Then the third thing, of course, is crime. Crime is going to increase. This, coupled with revolutionary activity in the first half of the 19th century, means that there's going to be riots in cities. There's going to be uprisings. You have a group of particularly young men who are unemployed, angry, and they're going to take it out on property often. So you're going to have these three challenges that all result from those overcrowded conditions of the cities. But then the other thing that cities are attracting more than just people, well, as well as people, are factories. Because of the steam engine's ability to move factories inland, factories are going to start to grow and develop within those cities. And the problem with factory growth is that it's going to produce waste. So just like human beings produce waste, factories produce waste. And this waste is going to be going into rivers. Um, this is going to pollute rivers. And it's going to, if rivers are your drinking source, your source of water for people to drink, this is going to help to spread diseases. It's going to help to lead to epidemics and outbreaks of a variety of bacterial driven diseases. The other thing, of course, is that factories tend, since they operate with steam engines, they give up smoke. And smoke goes into the atmosphere and it's going to pollute the air quality throughout, the cities. So, one of the things that has been pointed out before is that if you looked at the lifespan of an industrial worker in about the 1820s and you compare that to the lifespan of a farmer living in the countryside, the city worker was actually had a shorter lifespan than the person in the countryside. And that's because of the health challenges created by the pollution of both the overcrowded conditions and the growing number of factories. Now, I put down there epidemics because water is being polluted, because that's the drinking water. A consequence is going to be that bacterial diseases are going to start spreading. Cholera is one of the great examples. Chlorea. I hope. Cholera. Yeah, yeah. I'm gonna no wait. Cholera. You know what? I can't spell today. So cholera is going to be one thing. Typhoid is going to be another. You're going to have a number of diseases that spread rapidly on this crowded population drinking from polluted river sources, polluted water sources. So that's going to be yet another negative impact. So then what are the reforms for these urbanization challenges? Well, one of the most immediate reforms is going to be the development of sewer systems. So it's going to start with major cities and then gradually grow from there, where sewer systems are going to be installed as a way of cleaning up the cities. Second, governments are going to start enforcing health codes as well as building codes. By our standards, they're not as high level, but it is going to represent the government stepping in saying that health codes have to be respected, safety codes have to be respected in building codes for new buildings have to be respected. And what A and B both represent, and also C for that matter, is a growing involvement of the government in the life of the citizens. The government is starting to provide more services in order to ensure that cities, in this case, are cleaner and healthier. The development of police departments means that governments are committed to making cities safer. So, as crime becomes more of a problem within the cities, police departments are going to become funded by the government to provide protection of property and enforcement of laws. And the last thing, and this happens more in the later half of the 19th century, is the redesign of cities. So Paris, Berlin, Vienna are all going to undergo a facelift, if you will. They're going to be changed so that the cities are more logical. The cities are more organized and designed to accommodate the large number of people to keep traffic flowing. So, for example, I'll give you an example of Paris. Um, in Paris, there are these wide avenues that go right through the heart of the city. Those wide avenues were built in about the 1860s, 1870s, and they were built to create the space necessary for such a large city. It was sort of like us growing to 2,000 students at Damascus High School and us increasing the size of the hallway to accommodate the traffic of people. But the other thing is that since Paris had experienced uprisings before, these large these large boulevards would be an easy way to disperse the army to protect Paris, to suppress rebellion, so on and so forth. So these redesign of cities are going to make it much more logical make it much more easily to defend. It's going to make it much more accommodating to the large numbers of people and the increased traffic coming into it. And we're also going to start getting urban planning. Think of Washington, D.C., and the way Washington, D.C. is laid out. It's laid out as a grid with your letters and your numbers intersecting at 90-degree angles. And then you have the streets with states on it, avenues, cutting across at diagonals. So you get this logical layout, but you have flanking the National Mall two very wide avenues, Constitution Avenue and Independence Avenue. And that type of design is very common within 19th century cities. These wide streets that can accommodate armies having to protect the city, accommodating more increased traffic of people. So these redesign of cities is important to cleaning the cities up and allowing them to live more easily. If you had looked at Paris in 1810 and then you looked at Paris in 1890, you would have seen a drastic change in the design, in the ability to kind of spread the people out, and the sanitation. So that brings me to my next thing, the development of leisure. So we've looked at the effect of the Industrial Revolution on labor. We've looked at the effects of industrialization on cities. We also have the social effect of the development of leisure. So because we're having increased amounts of wealth, Europe is simply becoming wealthier. And when when the when the water level rises, all the boats rise with it. Now, there are some boats that are very, very big, and there are some boats that are very, very small. So the inequality of wealth is still there. However, over time, the average person is becoming wealthier. So what this leads to is disposable income, and people are not working every hour that they were before the Industrial Revolution. In other words, life is starting to create a separation between work and non-work. And when you're not working, you're playing. So there are development of activities to accommodate this growth in time for leisure. Government services are going to start to increase, providing parks, libraries, and museums. Um, these parks, libraries, and museums are basically open to the public, and it's a way of accommodating the growing amount of time people have to engage in leisure activities. Also, public education is another government service that is going to start growing because now you're starting to develop a society in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s where children don't need to necessarily work to support the family. Now, society can afford for children to go to school. So public education starts to pick up because the Industrial Revolution is creating a society where not everyone has to work. You could have a middle class family, not tons of wealth, where the husband and the father is working in a factory, making enough wages to keep the mother at home and keeping the children at home. So now the children are free to go to school. So you get this side now. Some of these children, particularly coming from the lower class, they don't get much past primary education before they go start working. But your children in upper class societies can stay in school longer and they start going to secondary schools, start going to universities. So we're seeing a real change in education as it's available to society. The other thing we get to is city life. So the idea is that cities are becoming centers of culture. This is where theater is. This is where your museums are. It's becoming a center to go listen to symphonies play, to listen to operas, to see ballet. That type of entertainment is growing. And you'll see that for number two, I put down centers of entertainment. That wasn't to be redundant. We can also talk about restaurants. We can talk about department stores. I think about New York City and Macy's being right there smack in the middle on 34th Street. Um, the development of professional sports, soccer stadiums are soon to be built. Sports are growing in popularity. Spectator sports are growing in popularity. All of these things suggest that The industrialized society is making room for leisure and making room for entertainment with this changing work structure. Our last thing is social class development. So we have this idea that you're always going to have the nobility, okay, at least until the 20th century. And the nobles, their wealth is based on their land ownership, having people work on their land, renting the land, and paying them rent. That's where the wealth is generated. But we have a new upper class emerging. These are the people who own the factories. These are the people who are captains of industry. If you remember your US history, they would be the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and the Vanderbilts. So this new upper class is immensely wealthy, and their wealth rivals, if not exceeds, their traditional nobility. And in your late 1800s, this class is emerging as a powerful class. Then below them are the well-off middle class. And they have jobs based in the Industrial Revolution. They're the ones who manage the factories. They're the lawyers who work for the factory owners. They're the bankers. They are the people who are making a good wage based on these developing industries associated with Industrial Revolution. They may not own the oil industry, but they are definitely making money managing it for the wealthier people. Now, these well off middle class people can afford a very good and comfortable lifestyle. And this leads us to what we call the cult of domesticity. So the idea is that as the home is becoming more of a haven from the world, as the home is separated from work like never before, there's a strong desire to make the home into one's personal palace, to make it into a castle. And to do that, you have to purchase things, you have to buy things. So this is going to drive consumerism. Furniture is going to, in terms of production of furniture is going to grow. China sets, one of the great examples of China sets. If you think about when people get married, a very common gift is a China set. And there's the very nice China that everybody leaves alone. Nobody ever eats off of those plates. You always eat off of some other plates. But the very good China, that just kind of stays removed from everything. And that's a part of this growing upper middle class. They demanded those types of things. And they imitated the upper class. They dressed like the upper class. They wanted to have similar products to the upper class. They may not have been able to afford the really top upper class life, but they could afford a very good imitation of this. They could own property, they could own a home, they could own nice things. The lower middle class is one that I think a lot of people can relate to because so many of us have our roots within this group. You know, if it's and this isn't just true in the United States. This is true throughout Europe. This is true basically in a lot of the world. This industrialization is giving those people jobs, but these jobs they pay well enough that they can afford to live on their own, or they're not constantly working. However, and these are like good factory jobs. Let's put it to you that way. These are factory jobs. They're well paying. You can afford to kind of have a one income family. But the lower class is coming from very humble backgrounds. They're not as well educated, but they see in their future an opportunity to improve their status. Maybe the parents won't improve their status in their lifetime, but they can create the conditions in which their children can exceed them and join that well off middle class. So, that lower middle class, they want to be like the upper classes and the upper middle class. So they want to get things in their homes that look like the wealthier segments of society. So they end up getting knockoffs. One of the great examples is what we call Wedgwood. So I was talking about China, about plates, dinner plates, things like that. A China set was a very expensive investment. So the upper class, of course, could afford the best. They could afford the best material and the most elaborative decorative plates. And the well-off middle class could probably get themselves a good set. Okay. The lower middle class had no chance. And an industrialist named Wedgwood is going to develop a way of making plates that are made of wood but have a veneer that makes them look like real authentic china, and it will be painted in a way to look like the good stuff. And Wedgwood is going to become very popular amongst the middle class because it imitates the wealthy while at the same time being very affordable. Then you have the lower class. These are the people who are working the unskilled labor jobs. These are the people with the very poor wages. These are the people working in the textile factories. They are working jobs that are very low in terms of pay, and their life is going to be much harder than the other classes I've mentioned. And that brings me to the last thing: is that while the Industrial Revolution may be developing a higher standard of living for everyone, there's an economic inequality that stays there. And people are going to start questioning that economic inequality and what to do about that. How to make the lower class have a more comfortable life. Because after all, the theory is going to go the lower class is the one that's making all this possible for the wealthy. It's the lower class who are putting in the labor. It's the sweat of those people that makes it possible for the upper class to enjoy such a lavish lifestyle. And the question is going to be how can the lower class start sharing in the wealth that society is generating? And that's what the next lecture is going to focus on, developing economic theories to deal with economic inequality. So, as always, bring your questions to class and we'll stop right there. All the best. Bye.